The judge looked down at the woman in the ill-fitting blazer she'd borrowed from her neighbor and asked, "Mrs. O.C. Bonsu, do you have legal counsel present today?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Laughter rippled through the gallery. Not the loud, ugly kind, but something worse. The polite, restrained amusement of people who already knew the outcome and were simply enjoying the formality of it. Her ex-husband, Preston Whitmore, didn't even bother suppressing his smile. He sat at the opposite table in a suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. His new girlfriend, Sabrina, 26, dental hygienist, somehow always in her periphery, was seated in the gallery directly behind him, her hand resting on the back of his chair like she was claiming territory. She filed her financial disclosure on a library computer. Preston murmured to his lawyer, loud enough for the nearest court reporter to catch it, printed it on paper so thin you could read through it. His lawyer, a compact man named Clifford Ibarra, who billed at $420 an hour, allowed himself one small, professional smirk. They thought they were watching the ending. They had no idea they were watching the beginning. What they saw was a 31-year-old woman named Lydia O.C. Bonsu in a borrowed blazer, sitting alone at the respondent's table with a single manila folder and a mechanical pencil. No paralegal, no laptop, no pitcher of water with a glass on a silver tray. What they didn't see, what not one person in courtroom 7B of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice could have possibly imagined, was that the woman representing herself that morning was the anonymous architect behind a software infrastructure used by 4 of the country's 6 largest banks, or that the trust she had established 6 years ago in Calgary, the Meridian Circle Trust, held assets that would have made Clifford Ibarra's entire firm look like a lemonade stand. Lydia had spent 4 years hiding that, deliberately, carefully, at great personal cost. She was about to stop hiding, but first, she needed 11 more minutes. The hallway outside courtroom 7B smelled of burnt coffee and the particular despair of people waiting for their lives to be decided by strangers. Lydia had sat on that bench for 40 minutes before the session was called. She hadn't brought a coffee. She hadn't brought her phone. She had brought only what she needed and nothing that could be taken. Preston had found her there. He always did, even after everything. Even after the papers and the 18 months of lawyers arguing over who owned the KitchenAid and the weekend cottage in Prince Edward County, he couldn't resist the performance of seeing her diminished. He walked past her with Sabrina on his arm, slowing just enough to make the cruelty intentional. "Lydia." He said her name the way you'd acknowledge a piece of furniture you'd decided to sell. "Clifford tells me the judge is pretty efficient today. Shouldn't take long." "Good morning, Preston," she said. He tilted his head. "You know the offer still stands. 12,000 and you walk away clean. Saves everyone the afternoon." 12,000. After 7 years of her managing the household while Preston built his commercial real estate portfolio, after she had deferred her own contract work to move with him to Toronto when his firm relocated, after she had restructured his family's property holdings into a numbered company so elegant and tax efficient that his accountant had quietly used the same framework for 3 other clients. "I'll see you inside," she said. Sabrina made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff, something designed to remind Lydia that she had been replaced. "She's going to cry in there," Sabrina said to Preston, voice dropped but not enough. "She always cries. Remember the mediation?" Lydia looked at Sabrina then, just looked. Steady, still, the way a lake looks before a storm when the surface hasn't yet registered what the sky already knows. Sabrina looked away first. In the courtroom, Clifford Ibarra was efficient and thorough and deeply pleased with himself. He had a binder. He always had a binder. It was tabbed and cross-referenced, and he held it the way some people hold weapons. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Whitmore, has been more than generous in his approach to this dissolution," Clifford began, straightening papers that didn't need straightening.
"Miss
O.C. Bonsu contributed no documented income to the household for a period of 3 years. She operated what she describes as a freelance consulting practice, which generated, by her own filed disclosure, less than $40,000 over the full duration of the marriage. Lydia didn't look up from her notepad. She was writing something. To anyone watching, it looked like notes. It was not notes. It was a timing calculation. 9 minutes. "The matrimonial home was purchased in my client's name," Clifford continued. "The investment properties are registered under a numbered company wholly controlled by Mr. Whitmore. The spousal support claim is without merit given O.C. Bonsu's demonstrated capacity for self-sufficiency. She has a graduate degree in systems architecture. She is not without means." The judge, a measured woman named the Honorable Rosemary Chukwu, peered over her glasses. "Miss O.C. Bonsu, do you wish to respond to the summary of matrimonial assets?" Lydia stood. "Yes, Your Honor." She felt the gallery shift. People who had been staring at their phones or staring at the ceiling looked up, not because she said anything remarkable, but because of how she said it, quietly, completely without fear. I want to address the characterization of my income, she said. The $40,000 cited was my declared personal salary from a sole proprietorship. It was the amount I paid myself. It was not the amount the work generated. Clifford made a note. He was not concerned. Miss Osi Bonsu, Judge Chukwu said, with a patience that was also a warning. Do you have documentation to support a different financial picture? I will, Your Honor, Lydia said. I'm expecting someone. The courtroom went quietly, uncomfortably still. Preston turned to Clifford. Clifford leaned in and murmured something about procedural irregularity. Preston glanced back at Sabrina, who gave him a small, reassuring shrug. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened. She had timed it exactly right. Two women walked in. They did not rush. They did not apologize for the disruption. They moved the way people move when they have never once, in their professional lives, been asked to hurry for someone else's convenience. The first was tall, somewhere in her early 60s, with silver-streaked locks pulled back severely and a charcoal pantsuit that looked like it had been constructed rather than sewn. She carried a briefcase of dark burgundy leather embossed with initials. EOA. She walked to Lydia's table without pausing, without acknowledging Clifford Ibarra, without acknowledging Preston, and placed the briefcase down with a sound that was almost architectural. Who are you? Judge Chukwu asked. Evelyn Osiabowai, the woman said. Her voice was the kind of voice that courtrooms went quiet for, the kind that expected rooms to reorganize themselves. Senior counsel at Osiabowai and Associates, Toronto and Vancouver. I apologize for the delay, Your Honor. There was a filing that required my personal signature before I could attend. Clifford Ibarra had gone a particular shade of gray. Osiabowai and Associates was not a firm you hired for a divorce. It was a firm you hired when governments needed legal architecture. It had appeared before the Supreme Court of Canada 11 times in the last decade and won 9 of them. You're appearing for the respondent? Judge Chukwu asked. I am, Your Honor. There's no notice of representation on file. There is now. Evelyn's associate, the second woman, younger, with the organized stillness of someone who had been trained by the best, stepped forward and handed a document to the clerk. Filed electronically at 9:47 this morning. Hard copy for the record. Clifford had recovered his professional composure, but only on the surface. Underneath it, his whole morning had just changed. Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to review. You'll have time to review, Mr. Ibarra, Judge Chukwu said. Mrs. Osiabowai, you mentioned a filing. Is this related to the matrimonial proceedings? Tangentially, Your Honor. Evelyn opened the burgundy briefcase and produced the bound document. My client has authorized the disclosure of her full financial profile, which was previously maintained under a trust privacy arrangement for professional reasons. What Mr. Ibarra described as a modest freelance income was in fact a nominal salary drawn from a holding structure, the underlying revenue of my client's work. Work she performed in part during this marriage and on behalf of projects that directly benefited her former husband's real estate portfolio, is considerably different. She placed the document before the judge. My client, Evelyn continued, is the principal architect of a proprietary systems framework currently licensed to several major Canadian financial institutions. The licensing revenue for the past fiscal year alone was $4.3 million. The courtroom went so quiet that the ventilation system became audible. Preston Whitmore's chair scraped back about 2 inches. Not enough to stand, not enough to run, just enough to register that his body understood something his mind hadn't yet caught up to. That's, he started. Accurate, Lydia said without turning to look at him. She kept her eyes on the judge. She had waited a long time to look only forward. Preston found his voice eventually. They usually did. This is fabricated, he said, loud enough that Judge Chukwu gave him a sharp look. Lydia was a freelancer. She did contract work. She wasn't running some licensing empire. I would have known. Evelyn looked at him. It was the look of a woman who had been doing this for 35 years and had heard every variation of this particular sentence. Mr. Whitmore, the filings before the court include 7 years of trust documentation, independent audit records, and technology licensing agreements. Your familiarity with your former spouse's professional history is not, I'm afraid, determinative. She hid this, Preston said, turning to Clifford. She hid assets. That's fraud. She maintained a privacy trust, Evelyn said, still patient, still precise. Common practice for individuals working in sensitive financial infrastructure. There is no legal obligation in Ontario to disclose the gross revenues of a holding structure to a spouse, only to declare personal income, which my client did, accurately, at $40,000 per year. What's in question now is whether that $40,000 reflects her true financial contribution to this marriage. She turned back the judge and opened a second tab in the document. In 2019, Mr. Whitmore's numbered company, Whitmore Capital Holdings, restructured its property portfolio. The framework used for that restructuring, the one that reduced his tax liability by approximately $230,000 over 3 years, was designed by my client, working from her home office, during what Mr. Ibarra described as a period of minimal contribution to the household. Clifford Ibarra had set his binder down. It was the first time in 17 years of practice that anyone in the gallery had seen him set his binder down. She designed the structure that made you money, Lydia said, finally turning to look at Preston directly. Her voice was even, not cold, not triumphant, just true. You brought it to your accountant and you let him take the credit, and you never once asked me if I wanted acknowledgement. You just said thank you and went back to your golf. Preston's jaw tightened. You volunteered that. You offered. I offered because I loved you, she said, and because I was foolish enough to believe that contribution didn't need a contract. She paused. I've corrected that belief. Judge Chukwu granted a 90-minute recess. Lydia spent it in a small conference room on the 3rd floor with Evelyn and her associate, going through the full scope of what was about to happen. She had been through it many times, but there was something about sitting in that room, in that borrowed blazer, knowing the borrowedness of it was almost over, that made the morning feel different. He's going to come at you in the hallway, Evelyn said, without looking up from her papers. He always does. Men like that need to try one more time. Let him. And the girlfriend? Lydia considered this. She picked someone like Preston. That's already its own consequence. Evelyn looked up then, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but its precursor. You know, when you first called me, I wasn't sure about this arrangement. The deliberate concealment, the slow reveal. It was a risk. It was the only honest option, Lydia said. If I'd disclosed everything at the start, the whole proceeding becomes about my assets, about protecting them, about Preston claiming entitlement to them. This way, the proceeding was about what he believed was true, and what he believed was true showed exactly who he is. She straightened the collar of the borrowed blazer. I'm going to return this to my neighbor tonight. Evelyn looked at her. You could have worn anything. I know, Lydia said, that was the point. When they returned to the courtroom, Clifford Ibarra had a new strategy. He pivoted cleanly, the way expensive lawyers do when the original plan goes sideways. No acknowledgement of the pivot, no apology for the 3 hours they'd spent building an argument that had just collapsed, just a smooth, professional reset. Your Honor, in light of the updated financial disclosure, my client would like to request an adjournment to review the full scope of. My client declines to consent to an adjournment, Evelyn said. Judge Chukwu looked at both of them. Mrs. Osi Abowagi, you've just introduced a significant volume of new material. Surely your client? My client has been ready for this proceeding for quite some time, Evelyn said. The material is new to opposing counsel because it was not shared earlier. It is not new to us. We're prepared to continue. Preston leaned over to Clifford and whispered something. Clifford shook his head once, tight, controlled. What followed was 2 hours that Preston Whitmore would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Evelyn was methodical in a way that felt almost geological, slow, inevitable, and reshaping everything it moved through. She walked the court through the financial restructuring Lydia had done for Whitmore Capital. She introduced the licensing agreements. She brought in the independent valuations. She presented, with perfect calm, evidence that the numbered company Preston had claimed was wholly his own, had been built on a framework Lydia created, refined, and had never been compensated for. And then she introduced the second issue. Your Honor, in the course of preparing for this proceeding, my client's forensic accounting team conducted a review of shared financial records from the marriage. They identified a series of transfers made in the 14 months prior to the formal separation date. Transfers from the joint household account to a private account registered in Mr. Whitmore's name, totaling approximately $94,000. Preston's face changed. These transfers, Evelyn continued, correspond in timing to several significant purchases, a vehicle lease, a condo deposit in Whistler, and a number of travel expenditures. My client was unaware of these transfers at the time they occurred. That's my money, Preston said, loudly enough that Judge Chukwu's expression hardened. Mr. Whitmore, the judge said, you will speak through counsel. Clifford leaned in, and what passed between them was brief and, judging by Clifford's face, not pleasant. Your Honor, Clifford said, my client acknowledges those transactions but maintains that, the Whistler condo. Lydia said quietly from beside Evelyn. Evelyn paused. Let the silence do the work. When were the Whistler trips? Lydia asked, not to Clifford or to the judge but to the room. She already knew the answer. She had known for a long time. March 2022. August 2022. December 2022. She paused. Those were the months he told me the firm was struggling. He asked me to delay a home repair. I'd been waiting 18 months to fix the foundation crack in the mudroom. Nobody in the courtroom said anything. Sabrina in the gallery had gone very still. The foundation crack is still there, Lydia said. I moved out with a bucket under it. Judge Chukwu made her preliminary ruling at 4:12 in the afternoon. It was thorough and it was clear, and it was, in its way, devastating to the version of events Preston Whitmore had spent 18 months constructing. The matrimonial home was to be sold, with a 60-40 division in Lydia's favor, accounting for the demonstrated financial contribution differential. The spousal support claim was granted, retroactive. The numbered company and its restructured assets were to undergo a formal court-supervised audit, with Lydia's claim on the intellectual framework she'd designed to be assessed by an independent technology valuator. Preston's passport was not seized. His accounts were not frozen. This was not that kind of case. But he walked out of courtroom 7B that afternoon, as a man who had spent 7 years married to someone he had never actually looked at. And now he had to live with what that said about him. Clifford Ibarra packed his binder with the careful, unhurried movements of a man who had billed enough hours to recoup the loss of the day, and would not be returning Preston's calls this evening. Sabrina was gone from the gallery. She had slipped out sometime around the Whistler revelation, quietly and without ceremony, the way people leave a restaurant when they realize they've been eating at the wrong table. Lydia stood in the corridor outside the courtroom while Evelyn's associate handled the paperwork. She had taken off the borrowed blazer and folded it over her arm. Underneath was a plain white shirt, untucked. She looked like a person who had just done something hard and was not yet sure how to feel about it being finished. Preston found her. Of course he did. He came around the corner from the water fountain and stopped about 4 feet away. He looked smaller. Not physically. Preston had always had good posture and the bearing of someone used to walking into rooms first, but in some essential way that had nothing to do with height. You planned this, he said. This whole thing, the borrowed blazer, the library printout, all of it. I represented myself accurately, she said. I earned $40,000 per year in salary. That was true. You made me look. He stopped, recalibrated. You made me look like I was persecuting someone who had nothing. I know. Because I was, he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been the beginning of understanding, except it had arrived about 7 years too late. Wasn't I? It was not quite a question. Lydia looked at him. She had rehearsed this moment. Not what she would say, but how she would feel. She had worried she would feel anger. She had worried she would feel satisfaction. She had worried she would feel nothing. What she felt was something quieter than any of those. A kind of distance. The specific and irreversible distance between who she had been when she loved him and who she was now. You asked me, once, she said, why I never talked about my work. Do you remember? He didn't answer. You asked me at dinner, maybe 2 years in. You said you felt like I was keeping something from you. And I said I just didn't want to make things complicated. She paused. That was the last time you asked. Preston looked at the floor. You stopped being curious about me, she said. That was the beginning of the end. Not the affairs, not the transfers, just that. You stopped wondering who I was. She picked up her bag. I hope you find someone who makes you want to keep asking, she said. I genuinely do. It's a better way to live. She walked down the hall toward the elevator. She did not look back, not because she was making a point, but because there was nothing behind her that she needed. The drive back to her apartment took 40 minutes in traffic. She called her neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Afalabi, from the car. I have your blazer, she said. I'll drop it by tonight. How did it go? Mrs. Afalabi asked. Lydia thought about this for a moment. About the ventilation system, and the binder and Clifford Ibarra's face when he set it down. It went, she said. I'll tell you everything over tea. She hung up and sat in the traffic on the Gardiner and watched the lake out the passenger window. Lake Ontario in March was a particular shade of gray-blue that looked almost deliberate, like someone had chosen it. She had always loved the lake. Preston had found it depressing. He preferred the mountains. She had never thought about what that meant until now. Her phone buzzed. A message from Evelyn. The valuator I'm recommending for the tech assessment has a 3-week lead time. I'll have the formal recommendation to you by end of week. You did well today. Get some sleep. She set the phone face down on the passenger seat. Outside, the lake held its color. Patient, enormous, unbothered by what happened on its shores. 3 months later, the audit of Whitmore Capital Holdings confirmed what Evelyn's team had already quantified. The intellectual property embedded in the company's restructuring framework was assessed at a value that required Preston to negotiate a settlement or face the prospect of a significantly more disruptive proceeding. He negotiated. His new lawyer, Clifford, had declined to continue. Brokered a number that Lydia accepted not because it was everything she was owed, but because she was finished. She was finished. The settlement transferred enough to matter and asked nothing of her going forward. She signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in a boardroom that smelled of fresh coffee and new carpet, and she walked out into a spring day in Toronto and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. She called her mother in Brampton. "It's done," she said. Her mother said something in Twi that Lydia had heard her whole life, a phrase that translated roughly to "a thing that is built in secret is the most solid thing of all." "Yes," Lydia said, "exactly." 6 months after that, on a Wednesday afternoon, she was in her new office in a converted brick building near King West. A real office now, with her name on the lease and a small tam she had spent a year carefully selecting, when her assistant knocked. "There's a call for you. He says it's personal, Preston Whitmore." She considered this. "Tell him I'm in a meeting," she said, "and that I'll always be in a meeting." Her assistant nodded and closed the door. Lydia turned back to her screen. On it was the draft of a new licensing framework, something she had been building for 6 months, something that was going to be, she was fairly certain, the most elegant thing she'd ever made. It was for a consortium of credit unions across 3 provinces, institutions that actually asked questions, that were curious, that wanted to understand the architecture before they signed. She found she was very happy working for people who asked questions. Outside her window, Toronto moved with its usual indifferent speed. Careers and suits, and a woman pushing a stroller through a puddle, with the resigned competence of someone who had given up on dry shoes and made peace with the season. The city didn't know about Courtroom 7B, or the borrowed blazer, or the foundation crack with the bucket under it. The city didn't need to know. That was the thing about being built in secret. By the time anyone noticed, you were already finished. She turned back to her work and she kept building.